For over 10,000 years since we first snared the first cattle for agriculture, we had picked up on trait-oriented manipulation through reproduction, likely from projection of our own behavior onto them, and observing them in the natural world for so long, molding the goats, cows, sheep, etc. like clay, things becoming a blindfolded blank slate in this way to our species, as it acted like it knew what it was doing when it was all guesswork. There were two disciplines, I guess, that eventually fused together research: farming and agriculture. Farming as in animal husbandry, and agriculture as in botany and floral and foods. These kinda overlap conceptually, but that's not the point. In 1800s, the Sheep Breeding Society and Plant Breeding Society had shared interests in the questions of heredity, discussing what should be bred, what environments certain animals should be in, and the issue of incest and using it to their advantage. Invoking the brilliance of the time, Gregor Mendel and his love of flowers that laid the groundwork for the initial blueprint, called Mendelian genetics. But we can't forget Swedish botanist Carl Linnaeus, the father of the concept of taxonomy, presented strong groundwork for categorization. In his essay, The Marriage of Plants, he believed plant lives were no less than animals, and challenged the heredity god of the gaps. At the time, there was two mainstream opposing views: pre-existence and pre-formationism. Generally, generation as it was called to generalize, the idea of how heredity information is pushed through the organism. Heredity information is pushed through the organism. Preformation theory is human people shrunken down, but all limbs and features are attached throughout the cells. Or no, not throughout the cells. Pre-existence suggests that God is involved, but human body parts are separated within the cells throughout the body. Carl didn't necessarily know, but his generation meant a hidden continuation that most just considered a blind watchmaker. He observed flowers always reappear before the fruit, pollen before the fruit, thus coming to the conclusion of omni vivum ex ova, meaning all life comes from an egg, reiterating what others knew intuitively, that each egg produces similar ancestors. Linnaeus explained away God and its particle gap by breaking down genealogy, the ancestral location that, quote, affects others down the line, as he called it, end quote, a place or accident, acknowledging things don't have a choice sometimes where they end up. He also realized a species difference, or specific differences uh, that flow through laws of generation via time and place. In an essay expressing welfare for nature to care for itself, strangely writing, all things in nature should contribute and lend a helping hand to preserve every species, so that the death and destruction of one thing should always be subservient to the other. Maybe he meant the overlap of organic biological functions like eating or being eaten, dying or succeeding into old age. These events, these events which all circulate in life, passing the material units of heredity in a continuous web, or the economy of nature, as Linnaeus called it. To segue into a specific but relevant political atmosphere before uh, getting back to Linnaeus, the culminating struggles of the Civil War factions and of the French Revolution, battles for dominance, were being coined as racist by certain historians in 1835, just going by typical differences like national identity, worshipped aspects like blood and nobility, or their perceived purity that both sides believed about themselves. The historian Augustin theory assumed the origin of conflict of class struggle, utilizing the same language of racialization. The end quote. The conquest of barbarians still bears weight today in our country, and despite temporal distance we descend, and stage by stage from today to the invasion and domination of Core Gaul and the native race. Meaning back in the 5th century, the invasion of Roman societies by tribes of Gauls of Germanic ancestors were reached to its end by the French Revolution. Karl Marx actually considered Augustin theory to be the father of class struggle. There's a bit to go over in another video, but the concept of castas in Latin America turned into a twisted appropriation by Anglo and Euro nationalists. So we use the caste system in a more arbitrary way as opposed to the simplicity of going by eye color, hair color, way of gender dress, emotional character, which the European model tilted into a more broader and complex framework. Colorism has always popped up here and there worldwide, but not in the way the West has cemented it today in the race coin way. The human division rabbit hole, partially beginning with Carl Linnaeus in his writings of Systema Naturae. Um, Linnaeus dividing humans into different types as the intuitive gamble of optics might convince someone, whether naturally or with mixed emotions depending on the person and their biases. Carl's variations being the, quote, whitish European, reddish American, quote, tawny Asian, edited to lurid in other versions, and blackish African, sort of ascribing to them stereotypical associations of us of cemented national first impressions by calling Asian behavior overall melancholic and Africans as having a phlegmatic temperament. Radicals likely have equivocated plant traits to humans, like comparing a plant seed falling into a bad location, not getting enough sun, to perceptions on poverty as the seeds falling in the wrong place. I have never heard this argument before, but it's a dangerous idea to look out for in terms of naturalism and political combinations. Human taxonomy is not inherently dangerous, but history shows botany is serious business. Gregor Mendel tending gently to his garden, this image of a loner botanist morphed into a jilted pruning of blood and autonomy. Gated by fences, different rows of humans to partition, or rhetoric of not mixing roots, symbolic of ripping out weeds and other foreign pests. In 1911, this connection was made by a colleague of Francis Galton, Havelock Ellis, in the spirit of Mendel, but tilted into a hate symbol, stating, end quote, in the great garden of life, it is no otherwise than in our public gardens. We repress the license of those to gratify their own children or perverted desires, would pluck up the shrubs or trample on the flowers, but in so doing we achieve freedom and joy for all, and we seek to encourage sympathy and foresight to pull out racial weeds by the roots. The gardener in his garden is our symbol of the God. As usual, end quote, by the way. As usual, these people speak euphemism even to sugarcoat for bloodthirsty attitude in their audience. Ellis, Galton, and eugenicists alike were fearful of the Second Reform Act of 1869, which allowed more people to vote, changing what they saw as the elite stock as 29 parliament seats were ceded by the Labour Party. Um, Galton considered the eventual paradigm as unwashed masses coming with them and calling them cacogenics for genetics coming from a sketchy source. The Victorian age and after were completely okay with segregating for health, taking it to the extremes in 1920s and 30s, which reminds me of Francis Galton's vericulture, meaning cultivation of man, which bears plant-based context like permaculture and agriculture. To cultivate in this dynamic meant separating people by rows with the help with the Supreme Court. The garden of the colonies and clinics rose out of the dark policies. In this framing that I see this chaos and suffering unfolding, we can see these institutions as gardens or greenhouses. But historically, at this point, the racial discrimination and naturalist ways of thinking were less and less as the racist jig was up and well-meaning individuals could conceptually separate their rhetoric, studies, and etc. from the extremist elements of science. Not to say science wasn't saturated in ilk agenda, which it did continue to be used for. thousands of people put into American camps, sterilized against their will throughout the timeline of 65,000 Americans destroyed between 1920s and 1970s. In 1940s, a teenager was falsely accused of setting houses on fire, so he was thrown into the colonies. In 2002, he explained this event years later, being numbed down, and this wasn't a hospital, it was worse than a prison, end quote. Between the 1920s and 1970s, a dark seed was planted. In jail for the beer hall push, the failed coup to control Munich, Adolf Hitler read up on the American Supreme Court laws. Hold on. Eventually using the same type of rhetoric to fit the greater goals, such as anyone suffering from a hereditary disease can be sterilized by a surgical operation, and once the court has decided on sterilization, it can be against their will. And we all know what this history that leads us to. And I'm going to continue this actually in another video. Alright, see ya.